Ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, I'd like to invite Mr. Khoo. He's the Director of Investments for palm oil and rubber NKE at Pemandu, because we're going to be talking about the public policy side of things. And just to give a bit of context, Malaysia continues to fight hard with Indonesia in terms of planted acreage, but the reality is true. Malaysia does not have as much land as Indonesia going forward, and the focus now goes back to productivity, to yield management, oil extraction rates, and so on and so forth. Khoo, do outline for us the magnitude of the challenge in terms of upping our productivity levels going forward.
What I like to say for a start is the future of the upstream of palm oil is in productivity and is in sustainability. Malaysia has about 5.1 million hectares, of which half are on the peninsular side, probably about 28% in Sabah and the remaining in Sarawak. We don't have any more land on peninsula. Tan Sri knows that. Even in Sabah, we're running out of land. So really the frontier state in terms of new palm oil planting is in Sarawak. But we then have to be careful about balancing the need for growing the hectareage versus sustainability and conservation. We do know that a large part of Sarawak has peatland. So that's an area that we'd not like to go into. As far as the NKE is concerned, when it comes to new planting for smallholders, we do not plant on peatland. But if you have peatland that are held by private owners, that's something that will be a little bit more difficult to manage. But anyway, the larger picture is 5.1 million hectares, maybe 6 million hectares tops. Indonesia is at 8 million hectares. We cannot fight this battle by upping the hectareage. We have to fight the battle by increasing productivity. What do we mean by increasing productivity? It means better agricultural practices. It means that we should be harvesting our fruits in a more efficient manner, pulling out the fruits using mechanized tools, for example. Having tools, for example, to suck up the loose fruits. And what Tan Sri said about how the Indonesians have high oil extraction rate, and a big part of that is the loose fruits correction, which we have a lot of problems with. It's a very menial piece of work to mop up the loose fruits from the floor. And also in terms of oil extraction, what can you do at the mills and all that? So really the future for upstream is in productivity enhancement, is in ensuring that we are doing things more efficiently. We cannot fight the battle by trying to be bigger than Indonesia, because we simply can't.
On the front of innovating continuously, and we know that there is no magic bullet to innovation that happens incrementally, sometimes painfully, where should the impetus come from, or could it be a coordinated effort between the private and policy side?
I think there's a lot of room for collaboration between the public and the private sector. I think in terms of mechanization, for example, the better way forward is perhaps for the public sector to collaborate with the private sector to ensure that where there are existing ideas, the existing ideas can be taken from pre-commercialization to commercialization much faster at a lower cost with better performance. And if you're doing something on your own, tendency is that you're not going to do, you're not going to get all the innovation. But if you open up and you collaborate with, especially with the private sector, because the skin is in the game, their skin is in the game, then I think you'll get better innovation.
Yes, I will like to support that statement. I think in terms of innovation for the industry, I think what Pemandu has done is to disseminate the information about the strength and the weakness of the industry and the areas that we need to innovate. As you know, our wages are going up. We don't mind with that. But wages have to be linked with productivity. So we need to have productivity increases. We need to have productivity increases. The average oil yield in Peninsular Malaysia is just over 4 tons per hectare. Whereas our R&D and also in smaller part of the estates, we know that we are capable of producing 8 tons, double that, So there's a lot of room for us to go up in terms of productivity, and we need that. Otherwise, we cannot pay our workers even better.
That's true. I think our average yield per ton nationwide is probably about 19 tons per hectare per year, and that's relatively low. There's obviously a lot of room for us to grow. With the private sector, we leave the job to people like Tan Sri Lee's company and all that. They're doing a very good job. They do replanting on a very regular basis. They tend to keep their mature palms of more than 25 years to not more than 5% of the total mature hectareage. So they're doing a very good job. On the NKE side, we focused on the smallholders because the smallholders, unlike the private companies, doesn't have the resources to do it. So we have to step in and do that. So improving the yields, improving the extraction, at the end of the day, it translates into dollars and cents that we can then use for social goods. So for instance, I'm sure Tan Sri's plantation would have provided very good accommodation for their workers, medical, services, education, places of worship and all that, which are all RSPO requirement. So in order for us to do that, there are cost elements involved. So the need for us to increase the productivity and efficiencies is very important.
Yeah, I think also with the newer planting materials in the industry now that we generate, our new generation of planting materials compared to what has been on the ground immediately will show a 20–25% increase anyway. So it does pay to replant the old palms.
On the staff side and the labor side, Tan Sri, within the KLK context, and people in the industry know that KLK is obviously one of the best run firms out there in terms of palm oil extractions. How do you continuously improve? How do you continuously get your productivity per person per acre up and continuously going up year to year?
I think the general average for the industry in Malaysia is that we have 1 worker to 8 hectares of land. That's the national average. So we do set targets for our managers, how to increase it to 1 to 8 to 1 to 10, which means a 25% increase in productivity. But this is only possible if we break down the different tasks of the plantations, whether it's in harvesting, how do we help the harvester to collect the loose fruit faster, in weeding, in what type of spraying equipment are there in the market that can help us to enable the worker, instead of doing 3 hectares a day, to do 6 hectares a day. So we've got to break down the job categories and innovate within each of these job categories to have the productivity increase.
I think on the workers per hectare, for example, it's very good if we can try to move from the 8, one worker to 8 hectares to 1 worker to 10 hectares. Bearing in mind also that a lot of this work are what we call the 3D job. Is dirty, demeaning, and nobody really wants to do it. So we have to import a lot of this from Indonesia and from, these days, from Bangladesh as well. And bearing in mind that Indonesia, the minimum wage has been set, it has been raised, their plantation hectareage has also increased, it will come a time where you can't turn to Indonesia anymore. And there will come a time eventually where maybe 30 years down the road, we can't turn to Bangladesh anymore. So what do you have? If you don't have proper productivity tools that will enable a significant increase in the take-home wages so that perhaps even local workers will want to take up those jobs. So managing that productivity, specifically from the yield in itself, is already a good demonstration of how important improving productivity is.
Well, the same issue with regards to minimum wage is very much within the palm oil industry as well. Now, of course, it's been quite a new phenomenon, minimum wage within the sector. At this point in time, have the net effects been net gain or net neutral?
I would say that by and large, minimum wage has not so much of a significant effect on the plantation. Tan Sri Lee can probably confirm or dispute that. But I think we were, even pre-minimum wage, already paying a certain level of wages that were higher than the minimum wage. The difference with the minimum wage is that you're now able to compute certain, for example, allowances that are fixed, regular, and paid in cash as part of the basic wage. So the difference is probably in single-digit percentage.
Yeah. For the plantations, I think the impact is, I would say, minimal. It's not a very huge impact because by and large, most of our workers, especially the harvesters, in the good months, they are earning over 2,000 per month already, because we pay them linked to productivity. So, but we are looking towards for the future. We are innovating for the future. We know the problem is going to come where we're going to be even more short in our migrant workers. So we need to prepare ourselves for the future, so that maybe in the future we may have to pay migrant workers on a minimum wage of 2,000 with time, or maybe 10 years' time. Who knows?
Well, gentlemen, the other big development within the palm oil industry is the evolution of the industry towards the downstream sector. And the downstream sector, fortunately or unfortunately, depends how you look at it, is very much a small component of the Malaysian palm oil sector, somewhere in the region of 5%. We do know that, of course, KLK has tried to make its inroads into that sector, but what are the challenges inherent in going downstream, gentlemen?
You're right to say that the downstream portion of the total palm oil business is only about 5%. That's very, very small. And we need to go downstream because, like I said earlier, we can't compete with, let's say, Indonesia on the upstream, on the pure CPO production. You have to go downstream. And not just that, you have to stay 2 to 3 steps ahead of them. They have a major influx of investment in refineries. So just making cooking oil and soap bars and all that, it's not going to be sufficient. We want companies to go down areas such as the production of surfactant, which is used in your shampoo, your toothpaste, your body care products and all that. We want to encourage the production of biopolyols, biolubricants in industrial use, glycerol derivatives, agri-chemical, using them in fertilizers and things like that. Now, those things have much better margin. And we have the head start in that, but we need to continue to push it forward. But to get into that business, as Tan Sri would probably tell you, is not easy because you must have the economies of scale. And a better proposition will be if you have an integrated upstream with the downstream, because your supply is then pretty much assured and you can also cost average and all that. So you must have the critical mass, and then making that investment in oleochemical is not without risk. Technology issues, talent issues, open market, global market competitive issues. Very quickly you find, for example, basic oleos becoming so competitive that what was profitable today may not be profitable in 2 weeks' time. So how do you keep ahead of the curve, taking the risks and all that? So, which is why the NKA Palm Oil has put aside grants that we provide to Malaysian equity to help them get into the oleochemicals, so that your initial capex is lower, so your payback is faster, and your internal rates of return are better. We need to help the private companies who are willing to take this risk, spearhead this venture on behalf of Malaysia, to give them a little bit of support so that they can go out there and lead the way and also compete in the global market.
Well, until recently in Tan Sri, I mean, Indonesia has been a bit of a laggard with regard to downstream as a result perhaps of their tax structure, but that has since been relaxed somewhat. At the practical level, when you go downstream and when you go to new markets in Europe, Tan Sri, we read that the Malaysian companies are in a way hindered because of the intellectual property protection and the trade secrets being withheld from the new entrants onto the block. I mean, at a practical level, how do you deal with these issues, Tan Sri?
Yeah. To deal with such issue, I mean, we need to have the technology, Sometimes we do joint ventures with foreign partners, because they find that manufacturing within Malaysia is still cheaper for the derivatives oleo. Cost of setting up factory is very much cheaper here because of our construction costs, and also the government is giving a lot of financial incentives for them to relocate here. So sometimes if we can bring the foreign partners here, they bring the technology, we bring our intermediate raw materials, so it could be a win-win situation. So that's one way. The other way, of course, is acquisition. Some of the other ways is development with technology supplier, but that's also a pretty long process too. But these are the routes that one has to take, because in basic oleos, as you have mentioned, there's no margins now, because Indonesia, with their incentives, are causing so much capacity to be set up within Indonesia.
Gentlemen, do you foresee a spate, perhaps, in time to come, where whether with public and private partnerships, or whether in terms of the capital being deployed to buy complex downstream companies, that's going to increase in time to come?
I think probably we're not there yet, but I think the government does have a role in terms of providing support to private entities in terms of intellectual property acquisition, for example. I think we need to look at the legal structure. Are we ensuring that whatever IP that is located in Malaysia is amply protected, and then you look at the fiscal side and see that if you locate the IP here and you're using the IP to generate income, is there good fiscal incentives that that will encourage the company to do that? So those are things that we need to start looking at, because our economy is moving away from manufacturing. Manufacturing used to, say, do 35% of our GDP, is now down to 25%. We are a service-oriented economy. Consumption is 50% of our economy, which means that we're moving more and more into services. So IP is a part of that. So we must pay a lot of attention in terms of creating an IP ecosystem, legally, fiscally, from a business development perspective, to encourage companies like Tan Sri Lee's to locate research and development, IP development, patent, and all that in Malaysia.
Now, within the context of the palm oil industry, gentlemen, the other big move is the fact that existing markets are constantly shifting, getting smaller, getting bigger, constricted, and of course, in Europe, the NGOs have a very loud voice. Ministers do listen to them, and in fact, they do have environment ministers as well. How are you dealing in terms of the environmental side of things, and in terms of where Malaysia really has to grab the bull by the horns? Because as we know, we're now discussing the free trade talks with the EU. We do have a new EU ambassador in town. Where are the state of the discussions right now with regard to the environmental side of things?
I think certainly as far as EU is one of those so-called areas where the anti-palm lobby is extremely strong, the others being in the US, Canada, and also some parts of Australia, and you're beginning to see New Zealand as well. Now, it is, in reality, there's some truth and there's some perception issue. I think we have to come clean to say that perhaps in the past we weren't doing things exactly the way it should be done, but we are. KLK is probably RSPO. Malaysia has the largest share of the global RSPO pie at about 46%. Indonesia is not far behind at 45%, but comparing the hectarage that we have, it means that a lot more Malaysian plantations are actually already RSPO certified. So we have taken that step, but the anti-palm lobby will continue, and it is our job, working with the private sector, to go out there and ensure that we're getting out the right information to the people in those markets, including the end consumers, and then on the government-to-government bid, do all the necessary things to make sure that our private sector players are not disadvantaged. So for example, the issue of the palm oil labeling in EU, to me personally, should be on the agenda for the EU-Malaysia Free Trade Agreement. It's one very big part of it, and right now, I think things are not very certain on that front.
Well, 2013, I guess the end of 2013 is when, under the Patriot Agreement and various legislation, Malaysia loses its global preferred supplier status. We will be, from then on, taxed between 4% and 6%, which can constitute some of the margins involved. Tachi, within the context of where we are legislation-wise, FTA talks-wise, how important is it for planters, and in fact large-scale planters, that Malaysian palm interests are protected within the FTA discussions?
I think this is a very important issue because, as you mentioned, at the end of 2013, EU will not consider Malaysia as a developing nation, and therefore we will lose our GSP status. And some of our oleochemicals entering the EU will be taxed between 4% to 6%. This is a very big problem for us, because with Indonesia still being considered as a developing country, we will be actually, we will just not be competitive, So we would like to urge the government to take this EU free trade agreement with EU much more on a faster burner, and try to resolve some of this issue, because they also need to protect industry for the downstream for Malaysia. We already hit by Indonesia, but because of Indonesia giving a very huge incentive to develop the downstream industry. We are already actually caught by that already, and we are put in a very non-competitive position. And with this losing the GSP, if we don't tackle it well, there could be another nail on the coffin for us.
Yeah. I think I'd like to bring the story back to the people at the end of the day, because if your downstream don't do well, your upstream will be affected. When your upstream is affected, your planters are affected. Now, 40% of Malaysian hectarage are a combination of organized smallholders or independent smallholders. It is their pocket that will be hit. And we're talking about creating sustainable income generation for the people in the rural area. These are the guys that will suffer if we don't do the right things, and if we don't deal with the anti-pump lobby, and we don't deal with the tariff issues.
Well, livelihoods is exactly what's concerned here. And, gentlemen, the various Earth summits over the past few years have talked about the West compensating the East for not developing their land. East Malaysia, a great deal of the land there is peat-based, which of course is riskier and more expensive, and it constitutes a big step up for smallholding planters. Is it a viable proposition for the West, in fact, the smallholders, to accept compensation to not develop the land?
Yeah. This is a very viable proposal, because in Indonesia, the Norway government actually contribute a couple of $1 billion US a year for this period for Indonesia to have what they call the set aside. That means not to plant their oil palm so aggressively by converting the jungle into oil palm land. I think for Sarawak, this is an ideal situation to go to countries like Norway, which are very concerned about the climatic change, and to negotiate with them for a package in return for not developing the peat swamp, for not developing some of the very, very hilly lands which have been given out.
I think this concept is quite interesting, because it's almost akin to outsourcing the green lungs. Because after all, Malaysia still have probably about 52% forest cover. I can't remember exactly. And what do they have in Europe? I think they practically have nothing left, so they have to outsource this environment side of things to us, so that, we are all part of the global environment and climate. Whatever happens here will ultimately affect them. So it's an interesting concept.
But does this not extend the issue? Because as we know, from a purely macro viewpoint, the Western governments have much less fiscal firepower than they used to have. How much longer can they afford to pay the poorer nations to not develop the land purely in the form of, in the guise of environmental sustainability?
But this incentive actually is not paid by EU, but by Norway. And we know that Norway has got a very huge national fund set aside from their oil reserves. And they know that they do something to reduce the CO2 emissions, and this is one way of their contribution to the world.
Yeah, I think that's true, is right. We're not looking at EU per se, but we're looking at the Scandinavian states, those who are doing even relatively well in the EU crisis: Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark even. These are the countries that can step up and do their bit.
Gentlemen, just before we open the floor for Q&A sessions, and of course, just like to remind everybody that both Mr. Khoo Kok Peng and Tan Sri Lee are open for questions. Just a quick wrap-up, if you can, Khoo, about where Pemandu and the government stand in the context of new markets, in the context of managing existing acreage, and helping the private sector come along.
In the first phase of our transformation, we focus basically on two areas. One, which is upstream, and that's where the productivity enhancement is the real focus. And then downstream is actually moving people more and more into value add, so that you value create. We recently did a 2.0 lab, and we added one more area to it, which is market growth and conservation. So this is dealing with the perception management issue in the mature markets, and also continue to grow the markets that are important to us, the Chinas, the India, the Pakistan, and all that. We need to grow that. At the same time, conservation is a cornerstone of what we are doing. So we must do a lot more work in terms of conservation. Some of these are in Sabah, where a lot of work is being done to try to re-gazette commercial land into protected forests, so that we are creating corridors between the basins so that the wildlife can move. We're working with the Sabah Wildlife Department, Sabah Forestry Department, NGOs like Hutan and all that. So that piece of work has started, but granted, there's a lot more that we can do. So with the 2.0 approach, we would cover upstream, downstream, market, as well as conservation, also addressing some of the gaps that we saw in the upstream and downstream. That should take us forward in the next 2 to 3 years.